Jennifer Stein is our next presenter, and I have to say with some bias, she is one of my favorite people on the planet, a very close colleague, a very dear friend. We have been involved in ever so many projects and adventures over the years, both here and abroad, and it's a double honor to introduce her. Jennifer will present an overview with slides and film clips about the ancient site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe. She will also touch on Mount Nemrati. Jennifer traveled...
Mount Nemrut.
Mount Nemrut. Jennifer traveled to Turkey in 2012 with Boston University professor Robert Schoch, a scholar whose name will be known to some of you, along with Linda Moulton Howe and other researchers who studied the work of Zecharia Sitchin to explore this ancient site firsthand. Jennifer has a BS from the University of Arizona, is an artist, an entrepreneur, an activist, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Jennifer has been reading, researching, and traveling to ancient sites for 20 years for firsthand exploration and examination. Through film clips of these travels and interviews with experts in the field, Jennifer will present on the significance of these ancient sites, the significance these ancient sites play in changing our perspective of our known history. In addition to sharing the theories of Robert Schoch, Jennifer will be sharing research of German geologist Klaus Schmidt. Jennifer founded Mainline MUFON 14 years ago in the Philadelphia suburbs. It's a regional branch of MUFON PA. In addition, she is coordinating members of the Noetic Sciences Shift in Action for Southeastern Pennsylvania and is state section director and field investigator for the Mutual MUFON network. Jennifer coordinates regular monthly programs at the Tredifferent, never get that right, Public Library in Stratford, PA. For more information, you can visit her website, which is mainlinemufon.com. And I will simply add that the program that she runs is a monthly lecture series in a wonderful common room at this beautiful modern library that just keeps going like the Energizer Bunny. Without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Jennifer Stein.
Aware of that. So thank you so much, Peter, for that great introduction. I apologize that my visuals seem to be flickering, and we don't quite know what that is, but we're just going to bear with it. It might be my HDMI cable, but if you see it flicker, it seems to return. And if you, in this side of the room, have any impairment by the way I've reconfigured my table here, please feel free to move your chair, hop up, or move to the other side of the room. I'm going to be discussing Göbekli Tepe. The word Göbekli actually means pot belly in Turkish. This is a hill in southeastern Turkey. It's it's really an enigma. We don't know a lot about Göbekli, but I'm going to try to share with you everything I know. The site is thought to be originally designed as a worship place or a center of worship. There have not been, in the archaeological digs, personal artifacts which have been found typical to living quarters, food storage, grain, wine, things like that have been uncovered. So it's considered to be a temple structure, often referred to as the first temple. Very fine articulation in unique stones that are T-shaped stones, as you can see here. This is one solid piece of stone, only finely articulated with a slight differential in depth to create this shadow line here that makes you think that you are actually looking at two stones, one on top of another, but in fact, That's just a fine articulated edge. This is another stone we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. So this is one solid piece of stone. I'll just call your attention to this well-known piece that's photographed a lot in National Geographic, and these are actually photographs from National Geographic. This fox-like structure, which is carved on the front of this T-shaped pillar stone here, is a relief sculpture. So the stone had to be carved by removing the surrounding stone to create that fox. The fox is not separately carved and then attached to the front of that stone. So when you think about the complexity that went into creating Göbekli, you can begin to see that it's quite complex. It's a Neolithic site. Neolithic means that it refers to a time when we believe that mankind were mostly hunter-gatherers. It was before we had domesticated animals, we had cultivated grains, before we'd learned sophisticated agricultural practices, before we made pottery, before we had writing. The site is located in southeastern Turkey, about 15 miles from a town called Sanliurfa. It's just north and east of this town called Sanliurfa or Urfa. Other people refer to it as Urfa. It's also right near the Syrian border, about 16 miles from the Syrian border. I was there in 2012 when the Syrian unrest was beginning, and it was still relatively safe to go, although we could hear some bombs exploding and some gunfire and things where we were located. It's unfortunately not safe to go there today. I'm going to try to basically tell you what I know, the basic who, where, what, when, why, and so what. What does this mean about human history? It does seem to throw a curveball at us. I'm going to move fairly quickly because I have some interesting film slides to show you, but just in this stone, if you can see it, this is a photograph taken at night. Many of the fine details in these stones are hard to see and hard to photograph in the daytime. So you have to particularly light in a unique way where you can see the refined sculptures and edges, because not all of the etching and sculptures are as dramatic as the fox I showed you. Some are very, very thin. So there's a thin edge going up the top of this central T-stone. This is one of two central pillars in the oldest stone enclosure, which I will be referring to many times as Temple Enclosure D, as in dog. They're named A, B, C, and D so far. So the D is the oldest one, D as in dog. It has what looks like a loincloth in the bottom here. It seems to be have a belt around it that goes all the way around the side. Right here are fingers that are coming around the front edge of this pillar. Later I'll show you pictures of the sides. There are long, thin arms that go up the side. At the nape of what they call the nape of the neck, although this is not a human being, some people refer to it as a stylized human being. This is a very skinny stone to erect, as you can see, and at the base of this stone, there are small birds that some people say look like dodo birds from the Galapagos. The site here is located right here. You can see this is Syria, and this is Turkey. This is the area that's blown up by this large map here. This is the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which are coming down. Actually, the Euphrates is over here, and the Tigris is here. This blue area here is a dam that was built by the Turkish government called the Ataturk Dam. We will refer to that area throughout the presentation. So I wanted you to have a sense of where this is located. It's also located in an area referred to as the Fertile Crescent. So this is what the Fertile Crescent is. It is where civilization began, where the Sumerian culture began, where we know that civilization began as we know it, with writing and sophistication, the cultivation of human structures and social structures, temple building. Usually the Fertile Crescent also refers to following the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers from the Persian Gulf up to the Mediterranean and then down along the coast of the Mediterranean. If you were a traveling nomad, you wanted to be able to travel not across a desert, but where you would have access to water and shelter with trees. It's a high mountainous region in many cases, and following the water lines, that's why it's kind of referred to as a Fertile Crescent. Let's see if we can go to the next slide and what just happened. Oh, okay, sorry. I didn't realize I had a transition in here. When you get to the site, this is a marker that you see. It kind of is, and we are actually high on a plateau. That's Linda Howe, who's standing right here. Some of you may know her. This is a close-up of the slide, Göbekli Tepe, as it's written in Turkish. And of course, it has a description here of the site and a map of a province showing you the site. It's a close-up of that. This blue area right here is the Ataturk Dam that was built. So you can see this area is also the area where biblically it's referred to as the Garden of Eden. We believe was in this area, although we don't know exactly where it is. You can see the town of Sanliurfa by this green dot, and here is Göbekli Tepe. Here is the Syrian border. It's sometimes really good to just have a sense of the area we're talking about. This site happens to be very close to an ancient biblical town of Haran. If you know your biblical history, you will know that Haran is the ancient birthplace of Abraham and Abraham's nomadic family. And it's very significant for Christians, Jews, and Muslims who trace their religious origins there. This is a picture taken of Haran in around the 1960s. Although some of the surrounding town around Haran looks a little different, this is what it literally looked like at the time of Abraham. Very little change had taken place at this point when this photograph was taken. These building structures, sometimes they're referred to as beehives. They're specifically built that way because it's cool during the day because the heat can rise inside these simple mud brick structures, and at night the structure provides a natural chimney if you build a fire in the middle of it because it gets cold in this desert-like regional area at night. So I just wanted to share that picture with you. It's another picture of these. You can see the chimneys here. It's a traditional building of mud bricks at that time. When you get to the site, it clearly says on the front of it that Göbekli Tepe settlement goes back 12,000 years. This was dated by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. No one in the American archaeological community is arguing with this interpretation, but many South American sites which have been uncovered, like Tiwanaku and Machu Picchu and other places in Peru, Ollantaytambo, and places in Mexico, when carbon dating came back from sites in those places that went back more than 10,000 years, the American Archaeological Association, and many times threw it out and said, oh, well, they're just Mexicans, they don't know what they're talking about. So no one was going to argue with Klaus Schmidt because German scientists are highly respected in many fields, and I just wanted to mention that. This is the owner of the site who was responsible for helping to find it. He and his family bought this land in the 70s to cultivate it to be a vineyard. And they started to encounter stones, large stones, continually. And he speaks no English. He's a very interesting gentleman. He walks around, when you go to the site, he walks around with a large picture book showing pictures of National Geographic and different film crew companies that have come there, Japanese companies that have come to photograph this site, because it's been, since it's made the cover of National Geographic many times and other magazines, and of course Ancient Aliens and film crews have been there, he's quite proud of the fact. So this is a little video that I made when I went to the site. As you can see, there's a walkway right here going into the site, right here. Most of the site is beyond this hill over here where these people are walking, and the bus pulls up right next to this area. This looks like the base of many of the temples, so it might have been an additional structure that was going to be built, or maybe had been built but then wasn't covered. But this shows you what the floor surface looks like. So as this runs, this is a little video of this space and some of the people on our trip that we went with. You can see that base is destroyed. It was probably the base of a temple. But this whole flat surface area is all limestone. But actually, in the area in the center part of the circle, where that gentleman was just standing with the white sneakers, they tended to create some sort of water impermeability to the main surface where these structures were. So in many cases where the temple enclosure structures were, they were waterproof. And then there were these edges around the outside of them cut and carved. The two central T's in the middle stood inside and were uprighted in grooves cut out like this. And in some cases, those bases are carved. I just wanted to share that with you and give you a sense. A lot of people miss that when they go to the site. They don't know what they're looking at. I, of course, got to go with Robert Schock, whom you see here with his wife, Katie. Robert's written extensively on this site and on other ancient sites that he's researched. You can see the ground cover here and the different excavation pits that are going on, and the wooden walkway behind him is how you get to see it as a tourist when you go there. You're not allowed to go down into the site because it's dangerous, and they don't want you to interfere with the archaeological site going on. So I'm going to share with you some photographs from magazines. This is from 2003. You can see here, this is the walkway into the site. It was before any tourists were coming, and the workers were taking stones away. This is a major, largest or oldest circle, temple enclosure D, that we're going to be referring to a number of times. But you can see these stones were still completely buried. You'll see several different pictures of them as they get unburied. You can see this arm coming down here and what looks like a fox tucked under the arm of these two central taller T pillars. And these are not that thick. We're talking like maybe this thick, you know, like a foot thick or less. And wide, they're about this wide. The tops of the T's are wider than the lower bottom standing part of the T. So these were delicate to stand and balance. I'll just share with you that the tallest pillars in this central area, in enclosure D, as in dog, are about 18 feet high, and they weigh about 16 tons. Göbekli Tepe was first examined, actually, and dismissed in the 1960s by not only Chicago University, but the University of Istanbul. It was kind of part of a sweeping survey they were doing in order to build the Ataturk Dam. They were looking for areas where they would dam it, these rivers up. They thought it was just a medieval cemetery, and they kind of abandoned the site. And it was, of course, 30 years later when Klaus Schmidt came back and took a serious interest in it, or about 18 years later. This is a little video of Klaus Schmidt discussing the site, so we're just going to jump into it. Now, Klaus is German. He speaks English with a German accent. You may have to slightly attune your ear to understand what he is saying. I'll play the short little film clip.
I found it in '94, but it was not completely unknown before, but I recognized the site as a sanctuary site of the 10th millennium. So we are here in a very exposed position on top of the mountain, the highest place here in the region, so it was clear so they chose this place because of its visibility, the importance of the location. Yes, it was not hidden in some valley or in the plains, but it was on top of the highest mountain here, visible from all sides.
So you can see this outcropping. This is limestone. It's a natural outcropping. And this here is a roadway that comes in. This is just an artifact of sun coming through one of those blinds over there. It's not part of the photograph. And right here is the site of Göbekli that's being uncovered. And here is a roofed area. I'll show you more in-depth pictures of this from the air. But what you see that's green here is where stuff is growing. This is believed to be an artificial covering to this natural outcropping, and it has to do with why and how the stones were buried. Here's a close-up shot, an aerial picture taken from a magazine. So this line you see in the middle is literally the magazine central part that I opened up flat to photograph for you. These are the vineyards that you saw the gentleman who had owned the area created, and he was trying to, of course, plant in here and kept running into the tops of these stones. This is a roofed area currently over a new temple enclosure that's being uncovered. And these are a series of circles here, 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 here that have been uncovered, like A, B, C, and D. Or maybe it goes A, B, C, and D. And here is more area being uncovered, but they're not finding more enclosures there. Or they're also not finding, they're looking for pottery shards, they're looking for evidence of workers that lived there, they're looking for their habitat, because that will give them more accurate carbon datings is what they're thinking, because they'll find leather goods or they'll find something that degrades over time. This is standing on top of the hill looking out. I think this is one of my photographs. So it's literally, you're standing about 1,000 feet above the valley floor below you. So when you drive in here, it's a long switchback ride up into this rocky area, and it's about 2,700 feet above sea level. Here's another picture of the natural outcropping, and I walked around here on this rock cliff, and you can find T stones that are being carved that were never fully released from the stone, just like at Easter Island, you can see that. So it's believed that even without any kind of metal chisels or sophisticated hammers like we have today, prehistoric masons very well could have used flint tools and stone hammers to chip away at soft limestone and create these sculptures. So it's not impossible that mankind could have made these. There's lots of evidence that they made these and then just brought them. The stone came right from this area. It's not stone that's traced to some other area like in Stonehenge, where the stones were moved 50, 60 miles before they were put into place.
It seems like you took as much energy to cover it over and build an artificial mountain over it as they did to build in the first place. So they were very serious about this. And Mount Nemrut, I think that's a very good analogy someone pointed out. There you have a huge artificial mountain on top of the mountain. This is actually in the mountains too. And same.
So that was just a quick little film clip. Sorry, I didn't preface it that you were going to see Klaus Schmidt. Not Klaus Schmidt, Robert Schock. When you travel with Robert, it's wonderful. If you ever have the chance, I highly recommend it. He gives you almost a PowerPoint a night, and usually what you're going to see the next day and why it's significant. So in southern Turkey, there are many ancient sites. We know there's lots of Roman ruin sites. There's Greek sites. There's ancient, Anatolia sites. This particular site, Mount Nimrut, dates back to the time of Alexander the Great or before. They think the ruler Antiochus that took over, one of the rulers in this particular area that was part of Alexander the Great's army was given this site when Alexander died. And Mount Nimrut, as you see here, which we went to, is a huge artificial mound of stones. So the idea of covering over ancient sites is not unheard of, but this is literally fist-sized stones that literally look like they were dropped from the air, or like this huge dump truck that flew over, dumped a huge mountain of artificial stones. You can pick them up. You can walk up here, but you have to be very careful. Actually, you're not allowed to by the Turkish government, because you could start an avalanche of stones that would then fall. There's subsurface terrain radar that's been done that shows that there is some sort of ancient site buried under Mount Nemrut. I'm not really discussing Mount Nemrut, but it's another fascinating site that Robert talks about in some of his books. This is another little quick video of Klaus Schmidt talking about the fact that the stones at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried. So whoever carved and erected these series of stones then also later deliberately buried them.
In Stone Age times, these circles had been buried completely. They had been backfilled by a lot of material. Some 100 cubic meters of material had been used to bury these circles.
Say again? Buried temples? Apparently so. These people went to great lengths to entomb these structures, and by doing so created a hill of 300 meters in diameter, as seen in this photograph before the excavation began. Maybe that's why they call it Göbekli Tepe in Turkish, which means Potbelly Hill.
So again, as you walk into the site today, There's a walkway now that goes all the way around, okay? This was the original walkway you saw in that earlier picture. And this is back around 2006. The walkway came in and they had built a walkway all the way down to this enclosure. You can see that the stones are more clearly uncovered here, exposing the two higher central T stones and then the surrounding stones around enclosure D. Here, it's a little less uncovered. You can see the walkway coming in, and you can see these walls here. Klaus clearly could identify that these were deliberately buried. Now, we don't know why. And although you cannot see it, this standing T has an arm coming down here. You can barely see it coming down here, and fingers wrap around the front. There's a waist belt here, and then there's a loincloth, and the front of this stone is carved with dodo birds. You saw that picture earlier, but this was before it was completely uncovered. And then you can see the base of the stone here. This stone was thin, uprighted into it, and they even used an early form of concrete that they made to upright that stone. Here, that stone now is completely released, and you can see that even by photographing it in this light, let's hope it comes back, you cannot photograph these really very well. You have to have very specialized lighting to see all the details I was pointing out to you. This is another little quick video from Klaus Schmidt.
What pushes the Neolithic human to create such a monumental sacred complex?
I know this was a big surprise because we didn't expect such a developed architecture in context with late hunter-gatherer societies. Hunter-gatherer societies had been dominating the human history in the old Stone Age. They are all hunter-gatherer societies. Farming was not invented, and the common idea was that from very primitive beginnings, the civilized way of life developed here in the Near East with the settled societies, and now we understand that it's much more complicated.
It all boils down to this. New information forces us to review everything we supposedly knew about human history, starting with hunter-gatherers who, before concepts such as settlement, agriculture and livestock farming even developed, brought into existence such an architectural feat.
So one of Klaus's main things he wrote about is that in order to actually build a place like Göbekli Tepe, it would have created, or you would have needed, a large coordinated workforce and manpower to build these monoliths or these stone circle enclosures. And he thinks that quite possibly religious intentions or religious desires, that these are originally some sort of temple, and that the desire to build a temple then coordinated the need for manpower, and the need for manpower then by default created the cultivation of grains and crops to feed animals. Maybe the animals were there to help move some of these stones, or also to help feed the manpower, and that eventually, through the desire to create temples, you created, by default, organized, cultivated societies. Whereas before, it was kind of thought the other way around, that first we moved into societal structures. Clans of families came together with their small garden patches and built larger and larger clans until small city-states began, and then we became organized enough to develop religious beliefs. And Klaus is saying, well, maybe it's the other way around. At the end of this presentation, hopefully if I can get to it, I'm going to be sharing some information about some ancient Sumerian texts which shed light on this. So again, these T-shaped stones are quite elaborate in some cases. These are some of the older stones. These are now covered over to protect them, as you'll see. It would be fairly sophisticated to carve this level. And you can also see, the reason I have this in here is these stone man-made walls that were then put into place to protect these carvings after they were carved. You wouldn't go about carving a stone, even on the sides of the stone, then to intend to bury it. So maybe the intention to bury them came after they were used or carved. This is Clout discussing this.
Now is belonging to the 10th and 9th millennium, but we don't have the oldest layers, so maybe the oldest layers is a little bit earlier than 10th millennium, nearly 12,000 years.
So 10th millennium is around 10,000 BC. Just to show you the soil level that was removed from the site here, you can see it. This is a walkway coming in. Again, you can see the soil level here that was removed. This is the walkway where you enter, and that's the valley below. This is Linda Howe actually standing here. Where is she? Oh, you can't see her because the light distraction is distorting her, but that's Linda Howe right there, standing there looking down at enclosure B. This is a picture of some of the elaborate carving from a magazine in Turkish, hence the Turkish script here. But you can see how elaborate these dodo birds carved. This is like a wild boar. There's a hole carved in here. You can see this is a bird with a maybe a ball that it seems to be holding in its wing. Where it's unclear, we'll discuss this in a little bit, what it could mean. Does it mean a solstice? Is the bird holding a ball? Because he's looking at it, is it like the winter solstice or the spring solstice? Is the series of standing stones at Göbekli some sort of astronomical observation to mark precession, is what possibly even Klaus Schmidt thought, and Robert Schock takes that even further in his writings about the site. This is a little movie describing the carvings on some of these stones.
Very, very interesting sequence of motifs which are here in a vertical row, which is much more than just decoration. And this sequence of motifs, yeah, it's reminding us maybe on Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's clear that we don't have writing here, but we have symbols which we can understand partially and partially not. We have here snakes, for example, it's clear, but here in symbol it's an H-shaped sign. We don't know the meaning of this symbol.
So obviously there's no writing, but there's all these symbols. This is a vulture head which was found at the site. We're not quite sure what the vulture head means. Actually, it was found near Göbekli, not right at Göbekli. But some people believe that the vulture head may refer or reference a traditional burial process which takes place in India and also in other sites where human remains are literally cut up and vultures then come in and take remains away. Now, there are carvings of vultures on the sides of these T-pillar shapes, and there have been thin bone fragments found at the site. So some people thought, okay, with this vulture head, maybe this was a burial place, and that's why these temples were built. It's believed that when the vultures carry parts of the human remains up into the sky, they're helping the individual return to the spiritual world or return to heaven or return to the sky. But of course, bone fragments could also be used to do very refined sculpture, and they could have just been there because of tools. So this is just a theory people have made up. We don't really know. I'll just also tell you that the way we date the site is through radiocarbon dating. You cannot date stone. I always like to remind people of this. If somebody tells you they dated the stone, they're not really being very accurate. Radiocarbon dating is defined as radiometric dating techniques that uses the decay of carbon-14 to estimate the organic material decay of materials like wood or leather or foodstuffs. And you can use carbon-14 to date accurately back to about 58 to 62,000 years before the present. So that's what's being used at the site. When they date things, they find organic materials that are decaying. Now, interestingly, there's another site nearby. I always think it's interesting to compare sites to other ancient sites. So Neveli Kori is another site that was it's now covered over. The Ataturk Dam is over top of it. But in 1976, the Turkish government excavated it very quickly and to build this dam. And it's similar to Göbekli Tepe. I'm going to point out this stone here in the front. Some of you can see it, some of you probably can't. There's little fingers here at the front edge and fine articulated edges as we see in enclosure D. and in many of the stone T-shaped pillars. But unlike being in a circle, this site was built in a rectangle. So there were center T's in the middle, and then rectangular T's stood around the outside edge that we believe were freestanding. Also, some of them have carvings on the side. Then they were encased into wall-type structures around it to make it look like a building. Now that it's been uncovered, it's unearthed. But another interesting thing that was found in Göbekli Tepe is a human sculpture, and the back of the head of the human sculpture that stood about 3 to 4 meters high was a human figure, and he had a snake going up the back of his head. Is this referencing some type of enlightenment? We don't know. There's a little video coming up about the excavation of Göbekli Tepe, where you'll see a photograph of it. And I just want to share this with you because I make a comparison to this and Tiwanaku later in the presentation. It's believed that Göbekli Tepe only dates back to around 7,000 BC. So we have these different dates, going on. We don't know if that relates to when the stone was carved, but when it was covered, and maybe different sites were covered for different reasons in different periods of time. Anyway, there are 26 circles under the ground at Göbekli Tepe we have found with sound-penetrating radar. Only 6 of them have been uncovered. So this is a huge, huge undertaking and will not be completely uncovered in our lifetimes. But this is an artist's drawing of some of the circles that have been uncovered and the existing circles that are found on this ridge here. It's mind-boggling. Pardon me? Yes, there are circles under the ground here that have been deliberately buried, yes. And probably the same way these enclosures have been buried, with hand stones put in place very carefully, then layers of soil and dirt, and sometimes even linen and things like this. Yes, it's quite perplexing. Some people compare it to Stonehenge because it's like an enclosure of stones. So I just wanted to show you some comparison pictures of Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe together. So you can see this is one of the T-shaped stones at Göbekli that's freestanding, has a top to it. Stonehenge had outer rings of stones and then inner rings of stones and then taller stones in the middle. So Göbekli is similar in that there were outer circles of stones and then taller stones in the middle, but Göbekli only had 2 freestanding stones, not stones with capstones on them, and not stones fit together like H's or, these were separate standing stones, all one solid piece. Again, more pictures of Stonehenge here and pictures of Göbekli. It is not believed that there was any top stones that connected these or any roof that connected these. And of course, the stones at Stonehenge are more roughly hewn without sculptures on them. And you can see relief sculptures carved on the stones at Göbekli of animals and snakes and scorpions and vultures. Again, another picture. So this is a quick little film clip with Klaus Schmidt describing what he says is a stylized human being. And he believes that these central T-pillars that had arms and hands are anthropomorphic figures, possibly. Maybe the T's are meant to be like human beings, even though their heads are not carved. The central T's seem to be slightly looking upwards towards the night sky, and maybe these are supposed to be human beings looking at the night sky.
So we have a still-sized human being, this is a T-shape as human being, and so we understand these stone circles as a gathering, as a meeting of such stone beings. 2 very important in the center, surrounded by other ones which are looking similar, which are smaller, less in size.
So it's hard to understand his language sometimes. I think this is another quick video. Let's see. Oh, no, okay. So this is a good picture of the centralized T-pillar here in the middle of enclosure D, where it's well lit. You can see the fingers coming around the front edge. You see these very fine differentiations in depth at the front edge. and what looks like a loincloth. This looks like a belt going around the person. These are H shapes, possibly in the shape of an H, or it could be two standing pillars, like at Göbekli, that appear to be holding hands. If you look at it closely, some of the anthropologists who have done lots of photo analysis of these say, oh, that H shape that you're seeing is actually the two central pillars in our circles, and they seem to be connected or talking to each other or holding hands, that the arms are there to show that the hands are in union, and it's about husband and wife or, partnership or something like that. It's still an enigma, and we don't know. Now, in the town of Sanlurfa, in another area, there's a museum, and in there they have a statue of another human figure from this period of time. He's referred to as Urfa man because he was found in the town of Urfa, and Sanlurfa means in the town of Urfa. It's like in French you have propositions which you use in front of nouns, so Sanlurfa is like saying this is the town of Urfa. So he's about 6 feet tall. He had black obsidian eyes that were set into his head. He has no mouth, a very small nose, and a very strange V shape around his neck. We don't know why he doesn't have a mouth. Is this some reference to consciousness?
Sculptures, the Urfa sculpture, was found at the Yeni Mahalle region of Urfa. Up to this day, this is the oldest human sculpture ever found. Let me draw your attention to the two stripes on the chest pointing downward.
It's quite perplexing. Does he have some kind of outfit on? I mean, the ancient alien theorists go nuts with this. They, of course, think, oh, that's evidence, it was an ancient, astronaut that came and he had a suit on. When you go to the museum, you can see Urfa man. He's clearly on display there. This is another picture of him from the museum, one I took and one I got from a magazine. He's only on display in the museum from this part up, but there was an original stone piece that was part of him that broke off, and they couldn't really repair it. This is another picture of Robert Schock standing next to Urfa man, and we all said, oh, it's your cousin, it's your twin, Urfa man has these arms that come down, right? These long arms with these fingers that wrap around to the front, similar to what you're seeing on these T-shaped pillars. Now, you also see this a lot in South America. We believe, but it's not clear, that Urfa man may be holding a belt or he may be holding his genitals. We're not quite sure. Now, this here is a sculpture in Easter Island. I'm going to draw some comparisons for you. It's not a well-known sculpture. It's in a museum. It seems to appear to be a woman. It also appears that she originally had deep cutouts for stones that set into her eyes. She has a long, skinny head. She has no mouth, very little nose, but she has long arms that come down. You cannot see in this lighting, but long arms that come down around the front and fingers that wrap around to the front. You can see a little tiny belly button on her, and she has little thumbs that pop up, like you see on the Easter Island sculptures, like you see on the Göbekli Tepe sculptures. So I'm going to start to draw an analogy for you. Obviously, her inset eyes of stone or obsidian are gone, but she's not well known, but she's similar to the Easter Island sculptures. Now, there's a number of other heads that have been found around Sanlurfa and in southeastern Turkey, and they're pretty badly eroded, but you can see noses and eyes in them here. Sort of rough sculptures that remind me of the statues in Easter Island. And of course, if you've been to Tiahuanaco in Peru, there's a particular area where all these heads are, all these heads are kind of in a wall. And maybe there's an overlap between these cultures. So this is Klaus Schmidt again speaking, and I'm really pleased to be able to share these films with you of Klaus, because Klaus is no longer alive. He died of a heart attack 2 years after we were there, swimming in a swimming pool in Germany when he went home to visit his family. So I'm going to just back up a little bit, and then here's the wall in Tiwanaku that I'm referring to. So he's going to talk a little bit about the stylized human beings and the hands that come around the front of some of these sculptures and make comparisons with them to other cultures.
That he is holding its funnel, but it's not completely clear.
As we can see, the hand position on this particular one is not very clear, but referring again to the hand position, how about the other, larger sculpture found at Göbekli Tepe?
It has like this.
Interesting, isn't it? At Göbekli Tepe, all the T-shaped pillars symbolizing human-like beings with hands and arms bear the same pattern in hand position as these later dated sculptures.
Hem de antik Mısır'da rastladığımız bu firavunların
This is Turkish.
Şeylerinde
You
kültürde
can't
rastladığımız
understand
hem
it.
de
But I just wanted you to show you the Easter Island sculptures have similar arms that come down the side and similar hands. This is a sculpture from Easter Island that was uncovered from this area where there's this large volcanic crater. It's called Ranu Raraku, and I have been there and seen many of these sculptures. They're a volcanic stone. This particular moai was uncovered in 1975, excavated and then recovered. But you can see these long arms that come down the side, these fingers that come around the front, and these thumbs that pop up at the bottom. Very similar to what we're seeing at Göbekli Tepe. This moai has now been since recovered, covered over again to protect it. But you can see how large they were. So again, I'm making a comparison here to some of the sculptures in Tiwanaku, Peru, where they're standing human beings that have these arms that come around and these belts. This one does not particularly have a loincloth, but this is Göbekli Tepe with this belt and these long, skinny arms. Now, I want to make an interesting observation to you that Brian Forrestor pointed out to me when I was on a trip with him. The original site at Tiwanaku is drawn here in 1856 by an artist, and it's literally just a series of large standing stones that are not encased in a wall. The Bolivian government built walls between these original standing stones. These were originally in the shape of a large rectangle. Doesn't that look like Neveli Kori? Isn't that interesting? Maybe there was a tradition, an ancient tradition that mankind had to build sites for whatever reason, astronomical observations, watching the movement of different zodiacal signs in the night sky, or watching for instabilities going on in the night sky. It's unclear, but I think it's really fascinating. Here you can see the arm coming down the side of this central pillar, the little fox carved here. Here you can see it more closely as well.
There are many temples, so we know from the excavations and from geomagnetic research there are at least 20 installations which we should call temple.
Mind-boggling. At Göbekli Tepe, only 6 of a possible 20 temples have been unearthed as of today. The tip of the iceberg, one might say. Down below, another 14 waiting to see the light.
And they're all following one main idea. The main idea is there are 2 very huge, 2 monumental pillars in the center of such an installation. There are enclosures, and the enclosure walls are surrounding them, and there are more pillars set in the enclosure wall. So we have the appearance is more of a stone circle than of a building. And it's quite clear that the monumental stone circles had not been roofed, so there was no roof. They had been open-air installations.
These same era temples from 12,000 years back, unearthed at Göbekli Tepe, show 3 different styles of form. They have been categorized as B, C, and D, all with different patterns. For example, while the pillars at C form a spiral, the same at D have an elliptic pattern. There is also the fact that the surrounding pillars at said temples vary in number. The only similarity between the 2 are the facing twin T-pillars at their respective centers. One might ask, what on earth do these T-shaped pillars depict?
So hopefully you could understand most of that narration that took place. I just wanted to really share that there are additional buried circles that have not been uncovered yet. So it was pointed out, or if I didn't, I want to point out that there is a bullhead shape at the top of some of the oldest enclosures at D. There is some speculation that Klaus Schmidt makes, and not Klaus Schmidt, Robert Schock, that possibly these refer to the constellation Taurus, and these standing T's actually look at Taurus in the night sky. I have a little video of Robert Schock, which is just like a minute and a half video, sharing his discussion of this that he made on the trip that when we traveled with him. He talks about his theories about Göbekli. And basically what he says is you're looking at these different temple enclosures here, and if you draw a line directly between the two standing T's, they almost are pointing in the same direction, but not quite. And what he also observes is that if you go back and count them, this was this was like 8,000, maybe this was 9,500, maybe this was 10,000, and this was 12,000 BC. So they go back in time, and Robert suggests that maybe what was going on is they were being realigned, or because of precession that happens over a period of time. Every 72 years, we kind of retard, and the night sky changes. So if you lived about 125,000 years, right, you could see the whole zodiacal constellation move across the night sky. If you examined it on the spring equinox or the winter equinox, when we stand still, you can get a long enough time to get similar images in your mind, right, of the night sky, and you could see that this precession changes over time by 1 degree. But of course, we don't live 125,000 years. But ancient cultures seem to have marked long time counts and calendars. You see this in the Vedic traditions, in the Indian culture, and you see it in the South American culture, certainly in Mexico. The Mayan and the Aztecs were marking long count calendars. It's quite interesting. So we have Robert Schock just speaking briefly about this.
And what I've done here is they have central pillars. You see the central pillars here? And I found, this is my lines I drew in. These are the orientations of the central pillars. And you see how they're slightly shifting with time? Everyone see that?
Right.
Okay. If you look out and you use one of these programs, I use Starry Night, but there's many different programs where you can reconstruct what the sky looked like at different times.
Yes.
And you look out on the vernal equinox south, because these pillars with their hands and arms are clearly facing south. And you look out, what were they seeing on the vernal equinox from pillar D, our enclosure D, about 10,000 BC, and I'm speculating here, they were looking at the Pleiades, Taurus, and Orion on the vernal equinox as the sun was rising.
So I'm going to jump ahead. Sorry I didn't turn the sound down on this. This is just a little video clip I made. Let's see if I can find the sound. Yeah, I'll turn that down because you're hearing wind from my camera, so I'll turn that down. So this is just a little film clip I made looking at the standing pillars. You can see the long skinny arm here coming down the side. I'm focusing in on a stone in the back that is carved in the back wall. That's like a scorpion. Here's the long skinny arm coming down the side. That's Temple C. You can see how difficult these are to really photograph and understand. Long skinny edges in the front. In the shadow up here, you can't even see the head, the bull head of Taurus, which we believe is at the nape of the neck. Here again is a close-up of these fingers. Here is a close-up I made of the belt, the front of the belt. In this case, you can see the H's here, which we call H's. Maybe these are standing stones that are linking arms. This one seems to be turned on its side. We don't know if that was deliberate. Here, they're all on their side. There's two what look like eyes rather than H's, but if you flipped them sideways, they would look like these. Maybe the artist just ran out of space, right? Like little kids do when they're drawing and they make something smaller or they flip it around. We really don't know. What's interesting, and I want to point out to you here, is that the oldest enclosure, the one built probably first, if going back in time, 12,000 BC, had a cutout that this T stone set into, but I mean, it's very thin and very narrow, and it is discovered that they actually had an ancient form of concrete that they created to solidify and upright this stone that they believe stood free. Another close-up of the belt, a side picture of the belt where you can see it a little more clearly. This line you're seeing in the back of the room is a shadow caused by the wooden post positioned to hold the stone upright. Here are these little dodo birds in the front of this base that this stone sits into. So you can see the amazing articulation and the fine differentials in edge going up the front of that stone. I have a lot of respect for these archaeologists that go through trying to preserve these stones and literally at times taking away the dust with like small paintbrushes to preserve these stones. Here's a picture of what they think look like Galapagos dodo birds. Here's some snakes carved. This is a good example of, you can see the elaborate carving done on the side. These look like snakes. This looks like a rabbit, possibly. And you can see these stone enclosure walls that were put in place. These are like fist-sized stones or small boulders that were gently stacked in to hold these pillars upright. So we know that they were deliberately buried. This was not a cataclysm, because you wouldn't have neat walls like that if it was some sort of cataclysm that buried it. When you go to the site today, many of the pillars are covered over like this to protect them from weather, from erosion, and from vandals. There's a lot of Taliban activity now in southern Turkey, and they're fearful that some of these Taliban may just literally come in and shoot off some of these, carvings, and they want to protect them. So a lot of things, when you go to the site, you can't even see today. They're covered over. So you kind of have to appreciate the site from former photographs and filmmakers that have been to the site. And again, you can see some of these enclosure walls. These are deliberately built walls. Some of the later sculptures on pillars are not as elaborately carved. It's almost like they carved them more quickly, or they etched out just a simple etching, an outline of an animal rather than a full relief sculpture of an animal. You can also see in the background here, do you see this standing T in the background? You can't see the whole thing, but you can see the wall around it. That T is broken, and part of that T is put in the ground sideways, and then the T is uprighted on top of it. So it looks like they rapidly repaired the site at the point when they were burying it, trying to reestablish what it looked like before they buried it, so anyone who would uncover it would have an appreciation for what it was. You can see this again here in the background. You see this T that's has been uprighted, but it doesn't have a base there. It's just uprighted in a series of standing stones around it. Again, here you can see this one was broken off and uprighted. And here's a big platform base and another platform base of, these are the central T's of this circle, and these are the outer standing stones of that circle. Now, this is some of the more elaborately and more perplexing stones. This one is carved, of course, with this bird here holding a ball. And many interpretations have been made. We're going to look at the similarities of other cultures that have birds with balls on their wings or birds with balls on their head, and what they mean, what they refer to, we believe, in other cultures. But again, this is archaeological speculation. It's not particularly my speculation, but I'm fascinated by making comparisons to other cultures.
Although part of it is still underground, the exposed part shows a bird carrying a sphere on its wings. Exactly beneath that, we see a scorpion.
So again, we don't know what they mean. Here's a depiction of a bird in Egypt with a ball above its head. What does this mean? We're not quite sure. Is it referring to a calendar? What does the bird mean? Now, bird images like this could actually have something to do with solar outbursts. This is very interesting. Robert Schoch, of course, brought me to the attention of a group of physicists who have organized themselves in a group. They call themselves the Thunderbolt Group. They put on conferences called the Electric Universe Conferences, and they study the electrical nature of the universe. So they study plasma outbursts and what massive plasma outbursts might actually do or look like in a laboratory, because many of these plasma physicists work with plasmas in a lab. So they can create instability in a laboratory and create various shapes that appear from plasma distortion fields. And I'll try to read to you a little bit about what I'm discussing. Intense solar outbursts could create distortion fields that appear in the night sky like these. And Anthony Peratt is a plasma physicist who's traveled around the world and written about the fact that all these petroglyphs that we see are actually known to plasma physicists as distortion fields. He believes that these ancient petroglyphs that he has found in over 130 countries could be representations of ancient past solar cycles where instability created this intense auroras in equatorial levels around the Earth, where you see these large ionized gaseous shapes in the atmosphere. And these are abstract shapes that are literally vibrational frequencies, electrically charged frequencies that could exist even for days, maybe months at a time. As long as electrical current is being channeled through them, they will appear. And it's known as synchrotronic radiation light. It's unbearably bright, and it's associated with large electrical storms. But again, they can create these in a laboratory. So Anthony Peratt believes that all these carvings around the globe that we see could actually be carvings of what ancient civilizations saw and recorded in the night sky at different areas. Well, if this is true, then that means that our sun could go through various stages of instability where we could not live on the surface of the Earth. There's lots of evidence in Turkey of cultures living underground. There's a big area known as Cappadocia, and there's literally 26 to 27 layers of underground caves, one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. It's literally like a high-rise underground when you go through it. I didn't put pictures in it here for you, but I highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic and you want to learn more, check out Walt Thornhill. He's an amazing guy. David Talbot. I'm sorry for this distortion field that's happening here. We can, yep, there we go. Thank you, magic worker. I appreciate it. So Robert actually is convinced that we have lost major parts of our human history because of solar instabilities, that our sun is not as stable as we might like to believe that it is. And these cycles come every 10 to 12, 15,000 years, and that we lose our memories, our cultural memories through this process because of magnetic instabilities. Most of civilization could be easily wiped off the surface of the planet because of this. And we seem to not remember, because we don't have maybe writing or a way to pass on history, except for stones, things like this that remain, or things that are buried that we can dig up underground, that tell us about the former cultures that were here. And he's convinced that there was probably 100,000 years of human history on the planet. Now, he's been going further and further back. Clearly, he believes there was civilization before the 10,000-year shifts that took place. We know that there was a change in the polar ice caps. You've probably heard terms younger Dryas, older Dryas periods of time. The ice caps used to cover most of the northern hemisphere, and then they receded back, and when they did, our seas rose. You've probably heard of many cultures, like off the coast of Japan. We can find elaborate cultures. There are many cultures that have civilizations found right off the coast underwater. In fact, in Easter Island, this is something Robert pointed out to us when we were there, the oldest moai in Easter Island, the oldest standing moai, and the least eroded standing moai were made of granite or basalt, very, very hard stone. Most of the left standing moai now on Easter Island are made of a volcanic rock, which is softer, and it erodes more faster, but basalt and granite hardly erode at all. There's no basalt or granite quarries currently on Easter Island. So those moai that are made of that had to be carved out of underwater areas where there's granite, under 30 feet of water. So I don't believe that the natives were diving and carving underwater. I believe the seas were lower 10,000 years ago, and the earliest moai that were made out of granite are carved there. Many of those have been taken away. They're in museums. University of in Britain, the British Museum has a couple. The Pergamon Museum has one. I believe the Metropolitan Museum in New York has a granite moai. So if you want to see these moai, you've got to go there to see them because they're not on Easter Island anymore. I think they have one in a museum in Easter Island. So it's really fascinating to me.
Show the position of it and the height of it. So that's clearly secondary, right? Everyone see that?
So maybe parts of it had
And look at this one.
Yeah.
See how they did the same thing there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that dramatic?
Yes. He's pointing to the one behind it.
There was perfection, and then there was some sort of an assault,
Yes.
and then they had to reconstruct.
And they had to redo it, or they were maybe doing it in a hurry to support the whole thing, and then maybe filling it in quickly afterwards. And my theory, well, I've talked about my theory, so I don't want to go into it too much now, but the plasma, Earth changes happening, but we can speculate. Were they building this, almost build it up as a protective structure for a certain period of time before they filled the whole thing in? Did they do this just before they filled it in? We can speculate on that. And there you can see it peeking out behind the wall, again, the wall being a secondary structure.
That's a sculpture.
And so I'm going to wrap it up. Göbekli Tepe, it was intentionally buried. The whole thing was intentionally buried by 8000 BC. And the question is why? And remember, I talked about the end of the last ice age, and I think there was major plasma bombardments. Katie and I have come to the conclusion that there were major plasma bombardments. We talked about the Rongo script that seems to agree with it.
He's a little hard to understand from my
Cement type.
camera.
Is that correct, Katie? Sort of
Yes, they
a
said
cement.
that's like cement.
Yeah, like a cement that they would set them
Cement.
in, which is really sophisticated. You're talking, 12,000 years ago, 11 to 12,000 years ago, and they're using some kind of cement to set them into the bedrock.
Well,
So how,
So this is a pillar that was repaired, as you can see. And this is from Temple Enclosure C. This is also from C. What I'm noticing, and I don't know if you notice this or not, but the stone in the later enclosures are much thicker. They're wider at the base, narrower at the top. They're much thicker, and they're set in much thicker bases, and many of the sculptures are much simpler. So it's very interesting. This, you can see it here now more from a distance. This stone and this stone are the central stones in this circle enclosure. It's tricky to know what this means. Does it mean that the simpler carved stones that were thicker at the base were easier to build this way and easier to upright, and that this was a development in sophistication of that culture? Or is it completely the opposite, that it's a de-evolvement in the cultural ability to do more sophisticated stones? Does that say 5 minutes? Okay, perfect. Here's another example. Another example, later stones, bigger base, also cemented in, but a much larger hole, simpler carving. That's a key stroke or a key cutout. Some of the stones have them in the top, not all of them. A keynote, we call it. I'm going to jump through some of this because I want to get to the cattle and grain text. Currently, under excavation is under roof to protect the workers and the stones. I stuck my camera underneath, tried to snap some pictures, really didn't get very much. This is from a magazine. This is interesting stone, not yet on display. Robert Schock found a very interesting bead there made of obsidian. This is a close-up of it. It had a hole drilled through it. That's a sophisticated culture that's making jewelry. Just more stones at the site. Now, this is what I want to share with you just before I close. Agriculturally today, we can trace back our grains to being originally cultivated in this area. So we know that farming originally came from this area. Also, when you're using grain, you can make alcohol. Alcohol consumption obviously leads, in many cases, to abstract thinking and may have led to the culmination of spiritual beliefs, but there may be something else which caused this as well. There's an ancient text in the Sumerian culture called the cattle and grain text, and this is in the bottom right here. I have a picture of it. This is on display at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I live, and of course I've been friendly with Zechariah Sitchin, read a lot of his work about the Sumerian culture. There's a story about these two characters named Lahar and Asnan, and they descended from an area called the Duku. We don't know what the Duku is, but what they did is they brought farming to humanity, and they brought the civilization of domestication of animals and things like this. So this is a little video describing that.
Text. The cattle and grain text is about a Sumerian legend. It mentions a certain mound called Duku, which was of interest both to Klaus Schmidt as well as me.
Funny story, this Duku story, which is not so popular, but I found this story in a book about Sumerian gods and spirits, and the mount of Duku was mentioned there, and the Anuna gods as anonymous gods without names, and on this mount agriculture had been invented.
Another little quick clip.
This mound, handed to agriculture and livestock farming as a gift from gods, is narrated as follows. In those days, Enki says to Enlil, Father Enlil, Lahar and Ashnan, they who have been created in the Duku, let us cause them to descend from the Duku. At the pure word of Enki and Enlil, Lahar and Ashnan descended from the Duku.
So that's a direct translation from the Sumerian text. So it's a little unclear. Were there beings that descended from the Duku? What is the Duku? Is it another planet? Is it some kind of mothership? Were there ancient astronauts? Or was this just the Garden of Eden, and people moved out from the Garden of Eden and then shared farming? It's really unclear. This is another unusual stone you can see at the Sandlerfa Museum when you go. Many people believe that this is evidence of ancient astronauts. I don't really think so. It's kind of this anthropomorphic being that looks to me like one being is birthing another being. This kind of looks like the knees of a person, maybe a woman, and a child coming out between her knees, but with arms coming down. It's very, very unclear. You can see Robert Schock in the back photographing this. Just a couple of other photos I took of this sculpture. That's Katie, Robert's wife, and Linda Howe looking at these sculptures found there. Robert photographing it.
We don't have for the moment. It's an argument to excavate more, also to excavate other circles, not just to have more stones and more pillars and so, but to understand better what is the story these Stone Age people wanted to tell the visitor or the observer with these images, with these pictures.
There is still so much we don't know and cannot decipher about Göbekli Tepe. From what the rituals really meant, to why were the floors waterproof? What went on in there? Why were they buried 1,000 years after construction? There are a lot of questions with no answers. As to who ran the show,
I had actually predicted that there would be a civilization of this date, which would be a Vedic civilization.
He said Vedic.
We can be certain of this though. Undoubtedly, they were the ones with a higher awareness. Worship was a crucial part of their existence. And ultimately, they left us the end product of their consciousness. And with every passing day, another layer of the mystery gets uncovered.
So that's basically where I'm going to end. I don't know if we have any time for questions. We may not, but hopefully I've stimulated your thinking about this enigmatic site in southern Turkey. Thank you.